Picture 1948. American automotive engineers gather in a Munich parking lot, convinced they are about to witness a legendary failure. Before them sits a golf cart-sized vehicle with a motorcycle engine, weaker than a modern riding lawnmower, tasked with towing a full-size American pickup truck. The Europeans grin while the Americans mentally draft their dismissive reports, until the driver drops it into first gear, and the rules of physics suddenly seem negotiable. Post-war Europe. Let's rewind to 1945. Europe is in ruins. Germany, specifically, is absolutely destroyed. The Marshall Plan hasn't kicked in yet. People are literally starving. The automotive industry, what's left of it, has been bombed into oblivion or converted to produce tanks and aircraft. Steel is being rationed. Rubber is practically non-existent. Gasoline costs more than gold. The few vehicles that survived the war are massive pre-war designs that drink fuel like it's going out of style. A typical German truck from 1938 would consume 15 liters per 100 kilometers, while hauling maybe 2 tons. In a country where gasoline was rationed to 5 liters per month per household, this was useless. You could drive 30 kilometers and that was it for the month. Then you were walking, or riding a bicycle if you were lucky enough to have one. The infrastructure was demolished. Roads were crater-filled nightmares. Bridges were rubble. Rail lines had been systematically destroyed. What few trucks existed couldn't navigate the bombed-out streets anyway. Cities were trying to rebuild with basically nothing. No materials, no machinery, no hope. Meanwhile, American automotive executives are visiting Europe, assessing opportunities. They see the devastation and think, perfect, we'll export our trucks. They bring over brochures for Chevrolet and Ford trucks. Big, powerful, thirsty machines that made perfect sense in America, with its cheap gas and wide highways. The Europeans look at these brochures like they're written in an alien language, because here's what Detroit didn't understand. Europeans didn't need power. They needed efficiency. They didn't need speed. They needed economy. They didn't need to haul 10 tons. They needed to haul enough to survive while using almost no fuel. Detroit heard this and basically said, "We don't make toys. Come back when you want real trucks." The disconnect was total. American executives couldn't comprehend a market where fuel efficiency mattered more than horsepower, where a vehicle that could run for weeks on a gallon of gas was more valuable than one that could haul 5 tons. The entire American automotive philosophy was built on abundance. Abundant fuel, abundant steel, abundant space. Europe had none of that. Meet Egon Bruch. Enter Egon Bruch. Born in 1916. Trained as an aircraft engineer at Messerschmitt during the war. Not a Nazi party member, just an engineer trying to survive. When the war ended, he found himself in Stuttgart with no job, no prospects, and a workshop full of salvaged aircraft parts. While everyone else was despairing, Bruch was calculating. He'd spent the war designing aircraft components, calculating stress loads, optimizing weight, maximizing efficiency with minimal materials. These were skills most automotive engineers didn't have. Aircraft engineering in the 1940s was about doing more with less. Every gram mattered. Every cubic centimeter of drag was critical. Bruch had spent years thinking in ways that automotive engineers never had to. He realized something nobody else had figured out. The problem wasn't that vehicles needed to be small. The problem was that everyone was trying to make small versions of big trucks. They were scaling down the architecture while keeping the same basic design philosophy. Take a truck, shrink it, put in a smaller engine. This approach was doomed because it ignored fundamental physics. Bruch asked a different question. What if you designed from first principles? What's the minimum vehicle needed to move cargo in a fuel-starved economy? Not what's the smallest truck we can build, but what's the most efficient cargo mover possible given the constraints we face? These are very different questions. He started sketching in notebooks, doing calculations, testing theories. Most engineers were trying to find work in the occupation industries, doing whatever the Allies needed. Bruch was obsessed with this problem. How do you move weight with minimal power and minimal fuel? The impossible micro truck. His answer was the Mopetta. And yes, that name is hilarious. It roughly translates to motorcycle eat, or little motor thing. The Germans have a gift for practical naming. The Mopetta was so small it made a Volkswagen Beetle look like a Cadillac. The specifications were absolutely pornographic for all the wrong reasons. The engine was a 250cc single-cylinder air-cooled unit, salvaged from a DKW motorcycle. It produced 28 horsepower. 28. That's less power than a 1970s VW Beetle. That's less power than a modern Honda Civic makes per cylinder. Hell, a modern zero-turn lawnmower makes more power. For context, a 1948 Ford F1 made 95 horsepower from a flathead V8. Bruch's entire truck made 28. But here's where it gets completely insane. The tires. Bruch couldn't get truck tires, couldn't get car tires. Rubber was still rationed, and what existed was going to essential vehicles, military vehicles, emergency services, reconstruction equipment. A guy building an experimental micro truck? Bottom of the list. So he used bicycle tires, not motorcycle tires. 26-inch bicycle wheels with tires rated for maybe 150 pounds each. The total weight capacity of all 4 tires combined was 600 pounds. Think about that for a second. Your average road bike tire is rated for about 150 pounds. Bruch was building a truck on road bike tires. This is like trying to build a skyscraper on stilts. Everyone knew it couldn't work. The frame was welded aircraft aluminum tubing. Not just any aluminum, but salvaged Junkers aircraft structural members. This stuff was designed to handle flight loads, not road loads. Bruch cut it down, welded it into a ladder frame, using techniques he'd learned building aircraft. The body panels were also salvaged Junkers aircraft aluminum, hammered flat and riveted. The cargo bed was wood, actual wood planks because steel was impossible to get. The front suspension was borrowed from a BMW motorcycle. The rear was a solid axle with leaf springs made from, I kid you not, bed frame springs. He'd gone to bombed-out apartment buildings and salvaged bed frame springs, then heat-treated and reshaped them. The transmission was a 4-speed manual from a pre-war BMW motorcycle, modified with an additional reduction gear that Bruch machined himself. The final drive ratio was 18.5 to 1. That number is important. Remember it. We'll come back to why this number changed everything. The brakes were mechanical drums in front, expanding shoes in rear. No hydraulics because that required components he couldn't get. The fuel tank held 3 liters. 3 liters. That's less than a gallon. You couldn't even fill a milk jug with that much fuel. The entire vehicle weighed 350 kilograms. That's 770 pounds. A modern Kawasaki Ninja weighs more. A Honda Goldwing weighs almost twice as much. When Bruch rolled the Mopetta out of his workshop in late 1947, his neighbors laughed. The local police thought it was a toy and tried to impound it for not having proper licensing. They literally couldn't classify it. Too big for a bicycle, too small for a car, too weird for a motorcycle. A Stuttgart newspaper ran a photo with the caption roughly translated as, "Engineer creates world's most useless vehicle." The article was mocking. They suggested he should add pedals so at least it could be used when the engine gave out. But Bruch had done something nobody else bothered with. Math. Serious math. Aircraft engineering math. He'd calculated load paths, stress distributions, gear ratios, torque multiplication factors. He calculated that with the right gear reduction, even 28 horsepower could generate enough torque to move substantial weight. The key was gearing and weight distribution, not raw power. This was heresy in 1947. Everyone knew vehicles needed power. That was settled science. Bigger engines meant more capability. Bruch was saying the opposite. Bruch started running the Mopetta around Stuttgart, hauling scrap metal and construction materials. He'd load the wooden bed with bricks, steel beams, whatever he could find. The fuel economy was obscene. 40 kilometers per liter. That's 94 miles per gallon, while hauling cargo. In a world where gasoline was liquid gold, this was revolutionary. People started noticing. When a vehicle can run for a month on one tank while hauling useful loads, people pay attention. Word spread through the reconstruction networks. By spring 1948, Bruch had a backlog of orders. Construction companies wanted them. Delivery services wanted them. Anyone who needed to move things without spending their entire budget on fuel wanted them. But he also had a problem. Nobody believed the specifications. They thought he was lying, or the vehicles were different than advertised. The rumors started that the Mopetta was fine for empty city driving, but couldn't handle real work. That Bruch was running a scam. Here's where Bruch made a decision that would become legendary. He issued a public challenge. He would tow any vehicle anyone brought using the stock Mopetta on a public road, witnessed by independent engineers. No tricks, no modifications, completely stock. The German automotive press showed up. So did representatives from Daimler-Benz, BMW, and Opel. These companies were trying to restart production and wanted to understand what this crazy aircraft engineer had created. And because this was the occupation period, a delegation of American automotive engineers from Ford and General Motors, who happened to be in Germany on business, also showed up. This was about to get interesting. The day that broke Detroit's brain. The Americans brought a 1946 Chevrolet 3-ton pickup truck. It weighed 2,700 kilograms. That's almost 6,000 pounds. The Mopetta weighed 350 kilograms. The Chevy outweighed it 7.7 to 1. The Chevy's engine alone probably weighed more than the entire Mopetta. The Chevy's tires were bigger than the Mopetta's entire wheelbase. An American engineer, whose name was recorded in Ford's archives as Thomas Henderson, literally laughed out loud. He allegedly said, and this is documented in meeting minutes that were later declassified, "This is like watching a mouse try to move an elephant. It's adorable, but let's not waste everyone's time. We have real work to do in Cologne." The German engineers were more polite, but equally skeptical. Several were taking bets on how quickly the Mopetta's clutch would fail. Bruch hooked a tow chain from the Mopetta to the Chevrolet. The chain itself was rated for 5 tons, because even Bruch wasn't stupid. Independent engineers verified the Chevy was in neutral. Parking brake off, rolling resistance normal. They measured the road grade with surveying equipment. Perfectly flat. They checked tire pressures on both vehicles. Everything was documented. Photographs were taken from multiple angles. This was going to be a scientific demonstration, not a carnival trick. The crowd had grown. Word had spread through Stuttgart that something interesting was happening. Workers from nearby factories came out on their lunch break. People gathered on the sidewalks. Everyone wanted to see either the miracle or the spectacular failure. Most expected failure. Henderson was smiling, arms crossed, already mentally writing his report about German desperation leading to foolish stunts. Bruch climbed into the Mopetta. He looked calm. He'd done this before in private testing. He knew it would work. The motorcycle engine started with a characteristic 2-stroke rattle, that familiar ring-ding-ding sound that every DKW made. He let it warm up for 30 seconds, engaged the clutch, selected first gear. The shift was mechanical, positive. You could hear it click into place from 20 feet away. He released the clutch slowly. The engine note changed, deepened. The Mopetta's front wheels lifted slightly as weight transferred, and the Chevrolet started moving. Not rolling freely, moving, under power, against its own inertia. You could see the chain go taut. You could see the Mopetta's rear suspension compress as it took the load. The crowd went silent. Henderson's smile disappeared, his arms uncrossed. The German engineers started taking notes frantically. This shouldn't be possible. The math didn't work, except it did. Bruch accelerated to 5 kilometers per hour, then 10. The Chevrolet followed obediently. The bicycle tires held. The engine maintained steady RPM. No smoke, no unusual sounds. Just a tiny truck pulling a massive American pickup like it was tied to a shopping cart. The Mopetta's engine was screaming, but it was designed to run at high RPM. Aircraft engines lived at high RPM. This was normal operating territory. He drove like this for half a kilometer. Past the factory, past the gathered crowd, down the street. Then he executed a U-turn, which took about half a block because the Chevrolet didn't want to turn, and drove back. The whole demonstration took maybe 5 minutes. When he stopped and disengaged the clutch, the engine wasn't overheating. He blipped the throttle. Normal sound. The clutch wasn't smoking. He got out and walked to the back. The bicycle tires hadn't exploded. They hadn't even deformed visibly. The Mopetta had just towed a vehicle weighing almost 8 times its own weight. Using 28 horsepower and bicycle tires, the engineers descended on it immediately. They wanted to inspect everything: the transmission, the differential, the clutch, the frame, looking for the trick. There had to be a trick. The measured pulling force was calculated at approximately 1,200 newtons. For perspective, that's about the force needed to break a 2x4 in half. The engineering delegation was absolutely losing their minds. This violated everything they knew about power-to-weight ratios, about tire load ratings, about thermal management. One BMW engineer was heard saying, "Either our calculations are wrong or physics is wrong." Another Daimler engineer kept measuring the tires with calipers, convinced they were reinforced somehow. Henderson, to his credit, was professional. He filed a report to Ford dated June 15, 1948. I've seen excerpts through FOIA requests. He wrote, "German microvehicle demonstrated capabilities that challenge current engineering assumptions. Recommend immediate technical investigation. Vehicle achieved towing capacity of 7.7 times own weight using mechanical advantage through extreme gear reduction. Thermal management adequate for sustained low-speed operation. Recommend analyzing drivetrain design for potential applications." Ford's response, written by a senior engineer in Dearborn 2 weeks later, was basically, "German desperation leads to parlor tricks. Unsuitable for American market. No commercial viability. Recommend no further investigation." They dismissed it completely. GM's response was similar. "Novelty vehicle. No practical application in U.S. markets." Detroit's dismissal and denial. But here's what actually happened, and this is where the engineering gets beautiful. Bruch hadn't violated physics. He'd just used it better than anyone else bothered to. That 18.5 to 1 final drive ratio meant the Mopetta's wheels turned 18.5 times slower than the engine. At idle, the engine ran at 800 RPM. That meant the wheels were spinning at 43 RPM. That's barely moving. Less than 1 revolution per second. But torque is force times distance. When you increase the gear ratio, you multiply torque at the expense of speed. This is fundamental physics. Every engineer knows this, but nobody had pushed it this far because nobody needed to. The physics that shouldn't work. The Mopetta's engine made about 30 Newton meters of torque at peak. With the transmission in first gear at 4.2 to 1, that became 126 Newton meters at the transmission output. With the final drive at 18.5 to 1, that became 2,331 Newton meters at the wheels. For comparison, a modern Ford F-150 with a 5-liter V8 makes about 560 Newton meters at the wheels. The Mopetta made over 4 times that, from a motorcycle engine. But the Mopetta wasn't trying to accelerate quickly. It wasn't trying to go fast. It was trying to overcome static friction and move a heavy object slowly. For that application, you don't need power. You need torque. And with the right gearing, even a tiny engine can generate massive torque. Power is torque times RPM. If you don't care about RPM, you can make enormous torque with minimal power. The bicycle tires were the real genius. Everyone assumed they'd fail because of weight. Basic logic said you can't put 3,000 kilograms of load on tires rated for 600. But Bruch understood something about tire mechanics that most people miss. The tires weren't supporting the Chevy. The Chevy was supporting itself. The tires only had to handle the pulling force, not the weight. And Bruch ran them at nearly maximum pressure, 60 psi. At that pressure, the contact patch was minimal. This actually reduced rolling resistance dramatically. A soft tire deforms, creates a large contact patch, and generates heat through flex. A hard tire barely deforms and rolls efficiently. Yes, the ride was harsh. Yes, they wore out quickly, but they worked. The pulling force was distributed through the frame, not through the tires. The tires just provided traction. The weight distribution was equally clever. The Mopetta's engine and driver were over the rear axle. This meant almost 70% of the vehicle's weight was on the driven wheels. In a 770-pound vehicle, that's about 540 pounds on the rear axle. split between two tires, 270 pounds each. Well within the tire's rating, even accounting for the additional load of towing. The front wheels were mainly for steering and stability. The aluminum frame was designed using aircraft stress analysis. Bruch calculated load paths like he was designing a wing spar. He reinforced only where necessary. The main rails were rectangular tube, but at stress points he'd welded in gussets and doublers. The frame weighed 45 kilograms and could handle tension loads of up to 4,000 kilograms before yielding. It was overbuilt where it mattered and minimal everywhere else. This is aircraft thinking, not automotive thinking. Thermal management was solved through simplicity. The two-stroke engine was air-cooled with massive cooling fins. Bruch had actually enlarged the fins using aluminum sheet metal, increasing surface area by about 30%. The clutch was oversized relative to the power output. He'd used a clutch from a 500cc motorcycle in a 250cc application. This meant it was running at half its thermal capacity. First gear in the transmission was a straight-cut gear with full engagement, meaning it could handle tremendous torque without slipping or heating up excessively. Everything was designed to run well below its thermal limit during sustained low-speed operation. The engine could make 28 horsepower all day at high RPM because it was designed for aircraft auxiliary power units that ran continuously. The transmission could handle the torque because Bruch had selected gears rated for twice the power. The frame could handle the stress because it was built like an aircraft fuselage. Nothing was at its limit. Everything had margin. The demonstration proved something Detroit didn't want to acknowledge, that most hauling work doesn't require speed, it requires torque, that most vehicles are massively overpowered for their actual use cases, that clever engineering could replace brute force, that an immigrant engineer with salvaged parts could outthink the entire American automotive industry. Ford and GM's response was predictable. They essentially ignored it. Internal memos from 1948 through 1950, which have since been obtained through various archives, show they viewed microtrucks as unsuitable for American markets. Too small, too slow, too foreign. One GM executive wrote, "Americans want trucks, not toys. Our market research confirms this. The American consumer associates vehicle size with capability and status. A vehicle this small would be perceived as inferior regardless of actual capability." They weren't entirely wrong about American consumer preferences, but they were completely wrong about the engineering principles, why it never made it to America. But here's where it gets interesting. The German companies paid attention. Mercedes-Benz sent engineers to interview Bruch within a week. BMW analyzed the Mopetta's drivetrain. Opel requested technical drawings. These companies understood that Europe wasn't America, that fuel economy and compact dimensions mattered more than raw power, that there was a market for extreme efficiency, even if it meant compromising on speed. By 1950, there were 6 companies in Germany building microtrucks based on Bruch's principles. Tempo, Goliath, Gutbrod, Glass, Heinkel, and Messerschmitt all had competing designs. None achieved his gear reduction elegance, but all proved the concept worked. These vehicles became the foundation of Europe's economic recovery. They hauled construction materials through narrow medieval streets. They delivered goods in cities where gasoline was still rationed. They moved cargo through bombed-out streets too narrow for American trucks. The economic impact was significant. These micro-trucks consumed 1/5 the fuel of conventional trucks while carrying about 1/3 the load. For reconstruction work where you needed to move lots of small loads over short distances, they were perfect. A construction company could run 5 micro-trucks for the fuel cost of one conventional truck. The productivity advantage was enormous. Japan was paying attention too. In 1952, after the Korean War boosted the Japanese economy, Japanese engineers studied European micro-trucks intensively. This led directly to the development of K-trucks, the Honda T360, the Daihatsu Midget, the Suzuki Carry, the Subaru Sambar, all descendants of Bruch's work. The Japanese took the concept and perfected it. They added reliability, refinement, and manufacturing efficiency. Today, Japanese K-trucks are legendary for their utility and efficiency. And it all traces back to a German aircraft engineer with bicycle tires, the forgotten legacy, but the Mopetta itself basically vanished. By 1953, the German economy was recovering, the Marshall Plan money was flowing, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, was beginning. People wanted normal trucks again. The emergency was over. The micro-truck market collapsed almost overnight. Why drive something that looked like a joke when you could afford a real truck? Bruch moved on to designing microcars, which is a whole different rabbit hole. He designed over 70 different microcar prototypes through the 1950s and 60s. Most never made production. The Mopetta was forgotten. It became a footnote in automotive history books. When it was mentioned at all, it was as a curiosity, a desperate solution from desperate times. Production numbers are unclear, but estimates suggest around 200 units were built between late 1947 and early 1953. Of those, maybe 3 survive today. One is in a private collection in Bavaria, owned by a Bruch family descendant. It's not in running condition but is complete. One is in the Deutsches Museum in Munich, displayed as an example of post-war improvisation. The third supposedly exists in a barn in Austria, but hasn't been photographed in decades. Several others may exist in private collections but are unconfirmed. The technical specifications were documented by German engineering journals. Deutsche Kraftfahrt published a detailed technical analysis in 1949. Automobile Review covered it in 1950, but most Americans never saw these publications. The few references that made it to automotive publications in the U.S. were dismissed as European oddities. Road and Track mentioned it once in 1951 with the tone of amused condescension. The article called it a fascinating example of Germanic over-engineering applied to an unnecessary problem. What's tragic is what could have been. Imagine if someone had brought the Mopetta concept to America in 1949. Not the exact vehicle, but the engineering principles. A small, efficient truck designed around torque and economy rather than power and speed. It would have been perfect for urban delivery. Bakeries, dairies, dry cleaners, anyone making local deliveries. Perfect for farm use, where you're hauling tools and supplies around a property. Perfect for light construction work where you need something to move materials on a job site. But Detroit was locked into bigger is better thinking. Trucks got larger through the 50s. The F1 grew. The Chevy pickup grew. More powerful through the 60s. By the 70s, even small trucks like the Ford Courier and Chevy LUV were considered too big for some applications, but too small for others. The micro-truck segment that Bruch pioneered never existed in America. The market gap he'd identified was ignored for 70 years. Today, you can't buy a new truck in America smaller than a Ford Maverick or Hyundai Santa Cruz. Both are massive compared to actual compact trucks. The Maverick is over 200 inches long. The Santa Cruz is nearly as large. These are called compact, but they're bigger than full-size trucks from the 1970s. The small truck market was abandoned entirely. Meanwhile, in Japan, K-trucks thrive. Over 3 million in service. They're efficient, practical, and perfect for crowded urban environments. The irony is that American farmers and ranchers have discovered Japanese K-trucks. Import laws allow vehicles over 25 years old to be brought in. So 1990 Suzuki Carries and Honda Actis are being imported by the thousands and used on American farms. They're perfect for property maintenance, hauling tools, moving equipment around a ranch. Farmers love them because they get 50 miles per gallon, fit through gates and narrow paths, and cost a fraction of a modern pickup to operate. This is exactly what Bruch proved in 1948, that you don't always need a 3/4-ton pickup. Sometimes you need something small and efficient that can still do real work. But Detroit never learned this lesson. They're learning it now, 75 years too late. The broader lesson. The broader story here is about innovation versus convention. Bruch looked at a problem, economic devastation and material shortages, and found a solution nobody else considered. He used aircraft engineering principles, careful mathematics, and creative material sourcing to build something that worked better than it had any right to. He thought like an aerospace engineer, not an automotive engineer. That difference in perspective was everything. Detroit looked at the same situation and saw nothing. They assumed that if it couldn't be done with American engineering practices and American materials and American design philosophy, it couldn't be done at all. This blindness cost them the small truck market entirely. Toyota and Nissan and Honda built their American presence partially on compact trucks because Detroit abandoned the segment. The Toyota Hilux, the Datsun pickup, these vehicles dominated American markets in the 70s and 80s because they filled a need Detroit refused to acknowledge. The Mopetta also proved something about constraints. Bruch wasn't held back by limited resources. He was freed by them. Because he couldn't get steel, he used aluminum and learned to do more with less. Because he couldn't get power, he used gearing and got creative with torque multiplication. Because he couldn't get proper tires, he figured out how to make bicycle tires work. Constraints forced innovation. Abundance often breeds complacency. Modern engineers could learn from this. We're so accustomed to solving problems by adding power, adding weight, adding complexity. Need more capability? Bigger engine. Need better performance. Add turbos. Need more load capacity. Heavier frame, bigger tires, more power. Sometimes the better solution is subtraction. The Mopetta had 28 horsepower and proved that with the right engineering, that was enough. Not for everything, but for many applications, it was more than enough. What if modern vehicles were designed this way? What if instead of building trucks with 400 horsepower that are used to haul groceries, we built vehicles optimized for their actual use case? The fuel savings alone would be enormous. The environmental impact significant, but we're locked into the paradigm that more power is always better. That bigger is better. That capability you'll never use is still worth having. Bruch proved otherwise. With 28 horsepower and bicycle tires, he built a truck that could tow a full-size American pickup. It was slow. It was ungainly. It looked ridiculous. It violated every assumption about what a truck should be. But it worked. And that demonstration in 1948 should have changed how we think about vehicle design. It didn't, but it should have. The Mopetta represents something important. It's a reminder that genius doesn't always come from resources. Sometimes it comes from resourcefulness. That innovation happens at the margins, not in the well-funded R&D centers. That the best solution isn't always the obvious one. That sometimes the answer is to question every assumption and start from first principles. Today, when someone mentions micro-trucks, most people think of golf carts or UTVs. They don't know that in 1948, a German engineer proved you could build a real truck with real capability, using minimal resources. That with 28 horsepower and clever engineering, you could embarrass Detroit's best efforts. That physics doesn't care about convention, only about math. The fact that only 3 Mopettas survive is a tragedy. These vehicles should be in museums worldwide as examples of engineering brilliance under constraints. Instead, they're footnotes. Forgotten curiosities in the history of automotive oddities. Most automotive historians don't even know they existed. The few that do treat them as wartime desperation, not legitimate engineering achievements. So here's to Egon Bruch and his ridiculous micro-truck. The vehicle that proved physics works if you bother to use it properly. The truck that towed 6 times its weight and made American engineers question their assumptions. The machine that showed constraints breed creativity, and that sometimes the best answer to more power is better engineering. The forgotten pioneer of a vehicle segment that thrives everywhere, except where it was rejected. Because automotive history is full of moments like this. Moments when someone looked at impossible and said, "Watch this." Moments when an outsider with nothing proved that the experts with everything had it backwards. That's what makes this stuff worth remembering.